The story for me began in the 1980s. I wasn't long out of university and was working in Glasgow. One lunchtime I visited an auction room in Bath Street and left with some old photo frames which I'd wanted and 4 Victorian photograph albums which had simply been part of the lot. The photographs were essentially family photographs and were of little interest to me at the time, but I was reluctant to throw them out, so they ended up in my loft. Fast forward to late 2025, I was in the process of moving house and was doing an attic clearance, and there they were, waiting to be thrown out. I had a long, hard, critical look and realised that I had a treasure in my hands. Those photographs were capable of telling a story thanks to a lady called Jean Shields from Irving in Scotland. Her story started many, many years, in fact over a century before mine.
She was obviously well-to-do. This is a photograph of her taken perhaps when she was in her late teens, and you can see an attractive, serious-looking young woman. Helpfully, she put names to the people in her photos. So this is her story, and sadly, it's not without real tragedy. Before I continue, I would ask that you like and share this video, and also please subscribe. In my last 3, I had a direct connection to the stories I was narrating. In Death on the Atlantic, about the torpedoing of a troop ship, my father was one of the troops on that ship. In Mad Albert McInnes, I knew the murderer, and in the Alison Street murders, I was a member of the same gun club as the murderer and his bank robber friends. My connection to this story is simply my ownership of the source materials. Jean was born in 1861 in Bank Street in Irving, Ayrshire, Scotland, and was the daughter of Surgeon William Shields and his wife Jessie. Jessie was the daughter of an Irving schoolmaster and landowner called Robert Henderson and his wife Jane. The Scottish Gazetteer, published at the turn of the last century, describes Irving as an ancient royal borough which was granted that status by King Alexander II in 1214. It's described as a quiet, industrious town on the west coast on the main rail link from Glasgow into England, and was also a seaport. It was reasonably prosperous with pubs, clubs and even a golf course, and had the distinction of being the scene for the execution of 12 women convicted of witchcraft in 1640. It also had a school, Irving Academy, which had been established in 1572 and at which her grandfather probably taught. The school remains in operation to this day. Sadly, Jean's father died from hepatitis in 1865 when she was just 4 years old. Hepatitis was a serious occupational hazard for surgeons at that time. Ironically, at the time of her death, Joseph Lister, the father of antiseptic medicine, was Professor of Surgery at Glasgow University. In 1865, he introduced the practice of spraying antiseptics in the operating theatre, along with washing instruments and hands with antiseptics. Following William's death, newly widowed Jessie had taken her small family, which now included Jean's younger brother Alexander, who was born in 1863, back to live with her parents Robert and Jane Henderson at Castle Park in Bank Street, Irving. Tragedy struck again when Robert passed away in 1880. He suffered an absolutely horrible death caused by a blockage to his bowels as a result of a growth in his rectum. His wife died 4 years later. The 1881 census shows the addition to the household of 2 young children. Those turned out to be Jean's cousins Robert and William Henderson. Robert's referred to in the photographs as Roy. I assumed initially that they had been visiting when the census was taken, but further research revealed that their mother had died in 1873 from what is described in her death record as abortion and collapse. Yet another tragedy. After the death of grandmother Jane Henderson, the Shields family headed off to Edinburgh, where they lived at 7 Rochester Terrace in Morningside, with her brother Alexander following in his dead father's footsteps and studying medicine. By then, Jean had met a Glasgow artist by the name of Robert Macaulay Stevenson, who went by the name Macaulay Stevenson. Anyway, the couple married in 1890, and true to form for the Shields family, Jean's mother died the following year. Like her new husband, Jean had an interest in art, but unlike him, she never gained any prominence in that field, and I have never been able to find any works by her, nor have I been able to discover any evidence that she ever held paid employment. I suspect that she never did, as she was a woman of not inconsiderable private means, owning a number of properties in Irving and Glasgow. She became pregnant in 1899 and gave birth to a baby girl who was named Jean Macaulay Stevenson, but sadly, just one day after her 10th anniversary and 4 days after the birth of her one and only child, she passed away as a result of complications arising from her labour and the delivery of her daughter. Reports about the family generally state that she died in childbirth, but this is untrue. She was buried a few days later in her hometown of Irving. That was the end of this lovely lady, but it wasn't the end of her story. There was still her husband, and of course there was her daughter. Macaulay was a few years older than Jean. He was born in 1855 into a wealthy Glasgow family, and, as I discovered, was the brother of one of the most famous and controversial Glasgow provosts, Sir Daniel Macaulay Stevenson, a Liberal politician and internationalist who during World War I was forced to raise court action in an effort to defend his reputation against claims that he was a German sympathiser. Macaulay, who also had an interest in politics, entered the family business after leaving school. However, he only lasted 3 years before pulling out to make art his full-time career. Strongly influenced by the French Impressionist painters, he was an early member of the Glasgow Boys, a group of painters formed in 1879 who sought to revolutionise the approach to art in Scotland. Macaulay was a spokesman for the group and a loud and outspoken critic of the mediocre art which he perceived the establishment to be promoting for the purpose of popularising art in order to attract more visitors to exhibitions. Those were, of course, pre-television and cinema days. He was a member of the Royal Scottish Society of Painters and Watercolours and painted mainly landscapes, gaining the nickname Moonlighter because of his particular skill in painting nighttime scenes. During his long life, Macaulay exhibited his paintings all over the world, and his works were hung in galleries in many European countries and in the USA. Yet he is virtually forgotten in his homeland, although his paintings do come up for auction both here and abroad from time to time. 2 years after Jean died, he married a fellow artist called Stansmore Dean. He had a studio at 58 West Regent Street in Glasgow, where he continued to work before transferring his activities to his home in Robinsfield, Bardowie Loch, on the banks of Bardowie Loch. The house, which sat on substantial grounds and which indeed was substantial itself, had been renovated and completely remodelled by Macaulay and Charles Rennie Mackintosh, who was a close family friend. His new studio gave him wonderful views over the loch and the hills beyond, and provided great inspiration for a number of his paintings. Things turned a little sour for Macaulay in 1910 when he was forced into bankruptcy by his tailor over unpaid bills. In those days, a debtor could remain bankrupt for many years, and perhaps to avoid the stigma of his financial predicament, he took his family off to live in Montreux, in the north coast of France. He lived there through the Great War and was still there when he was discharged from his bankruptcy in 1919. I was perplexed, however, to discover a 1933 article in the Scotsman which indicated that Macaulay had hosted a garden fete on the grounds of Robinsfield, which had been attended by over 1,000 invited guests. Having been sequestrated, I would have expected him to have lost Robinsfield. An examination of the valuation rolls for 1915 showed him as a tenant of Robinsfield, with his 15-year-old daughter Jean as its proprietor. He presumably passed ownership to her in order to prevent his creditors from getting hold of his home. During my career in law, I was involved in quite a few sequestrations, and passing your assets to a relative would not normally work. Known as a gratuitous alienation, such a scheme could and usually would be overturned. However, modern bankruptcy legislation did not come into force until 1913, so I assume that the law as it existed in 1910, when his sequestration took place, was more lax when it came to family transfers. By the 1930s, Macaulay and his wife Stansmore were spending considerable amounts of their time in Kirkudbright, where an artist colony had been thriving for many years, and where he established a studio near Milburn Street. The couple lived in a series of hotels in and around the town, and Macaulay gained a reputation as a drinker and raconteur. Stansmore died in 1944 from a heart attack. Her death certificate shows her usual residence to be the Borg Hotel in Kirkudbright, but oddly shows Macaulay as resident at 74 Queen Street, Castle Douglas, which is a nearby town. I say oddly because this address was used in the 1930s for art exhibitions. The great man himself finally expired in 1952, having reached the ripe old age of 98. He died in his old home at Robinsfield, where his daughter Jean had been living. The entry in his death certificate states that Macaulay died of heart failure aged 98. I think he did pretty well.
So what did become of his daughter, who incidentally called herself Jean Macaulay Stevenson? Well, she remained at Robinsfield after her father's death, but sold off a lot of the family treasures in the 1980s, and I assume that's how the photograph albums that I acquired came to be on sale. Like her father, she was an artist, mainly in ceramics. However, she didn't attain any prominence in that field that I can discover. She never married either, so when she died in 1990, she brought the family line to a close. Now that's the end of the story, but it's not the end. There are many photographs in Jean Shields' albums, which have more stories to tell, and so my research continues. Thank you for taking the time to watch. There will be more. Please remember to like, subscribe, and most importantly, please share. Comments are always welcome, particularly if they relate to the story and provide more information about it. I always respond. Bye for now.